The winter of 1933 buried a lot of things in America. It buried savings. It buried farms under dust and mortgage paper. And according to 3 men who worked a drilling rig outside a small town in Rusk County, Texas, it buried a report about something they pulled out of the ground at 90 feet. They were not looking for anything strange. They were looking for water. That autumn had been merciless, and the shallow wells around the county had either gone dry or turned to a rust-colored sludge that no cattle would touch. So a rancher put in an order for a deeper well, and a crew from a small drilling outfit rolled their rig out past the last fence line and set up over a spot a surveyor had marked with a wooden stake. For the first 60 feet, it was ordinary work. Sand, then clay, then a band of soft limestone that came up the auger in wet grey curls. The men had drilled 100 wells like it. They ate their lunch in the shade of the truck and complained about the price of everything. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Then, at roughly 90 feet, the bit stopped turning. Not the way it stops when you hit hard rock. Hard rock fights you. It grinds and screams and throws sparks up the pipe. This was different. The driller, a man the county records list as Elias Warner, said the bit sat down onto something and simply refused to bite. It skated. It slid sideways like a knife dropped onto a kitchen counter. When they pulled the string up and looked at the cutting head, the teeth were polished bright, not chipped, not cracked, polished, the way a stone gets polished by 100 years of hands. Warner had been drilling since before the Great War. He had hit granite, he had hit iron pan, he had once hit an old buried wagon axle that somebody had lost in a flood. He had never in his life hit anything that behaved like this. So he did what a careful man does. He lowered a weighted line down the casing and let it rest, and then he tapped it, and then he listened, and the ground rang. Now, you have to understand what that means to a man who spends his life listening to dirt. Dirt is dead. Dirt swallows sound. When your line hits the bottom of a real well, you get a dull thud, a wet slap, and nothing more. What Warner heard was a clean, hollow tone that carried back up the pipe and hung in the air for a full second. He made his youngest man do it 3 more times to be sure he was not imagining it. Each time, the same note. A struck bell, 90 feet down, under a Texas cattle pasture in the worst year of the Great Depression. That is where this story starts. But it is not where it ends, because the thing they eventually brought up into the daylight was not a boulder, and it was not a wagon axle. And the county report that described it, the one written in a surveyor's careful hand and filed with a case number before the first snow, was gone by the time anyone thought to ask for it again. So the question we are going to sit with for the next while is a simple one, and it is also the kind of question that gets reports to vanish. What was under that pasture? And if the answer is what those 3 men swore it was until the day they died, then who decided that the rest of us were not allowed to know? To make sense of any of this, we have to leave the drilling rig for a minute and talk about the year itself, because 1933 was not a normal year, and Rusk County was not a normal place. By the autumn of that year, the county sat on top of the largest oil field anyone in America had ever seen. The East Texas field had come in 2 years earlier, and it had turned quiet farm towns like Kilgore and Henderson into loud, muddy, money-soaked boom towns almost overnight. Derricks stood so close together in downtown Kilgore that you could climb from one to the next without touching the ground. Men who had been picking cotton for pennies were suddenly leasing mineral rights and buying automobiles. The whole region was a place where people were used to the idea that unimaginable value was sitting just beneath their feet, waiting for the right drill to reach it. That matters, because it means the men on that rig were not superstitious fools who ran screaming from a hard rock. They were professionals in an oil county. They knew the ground here. They knew what was supposed to be down there, layer by layer, and they knew, better than almost anyone alive, that what they were tapping on was not on the chart. It also matters for a colder reason. In a place where the ground was worth a fortune, the last thing certain people wanted was a mystery that might freeze up a drilling permit, tie land in a legal knot, or invite the government to come poking around. Keep that in your back pocket. We will need it later. It helps to know a little more about the outfit itself, because the men on that rig were not drifters passing through. The drilling company was a family concern that had been sinking wells in East Texas for the better part of 2 decades. They had a reputation. In a boom county full of fly-by-night crews and men who would tell you anything to get a contract, this outfit was the boring, reliable one, the crew that ranchers hired precisely because they did not embellish and they did not spook. That is a detail worth holding on to. When a crew whose entire business depends on being calm and unimaginative comes back into town white in the face, talking about a floor that rings, the men who know them do not laugh right away. They ask what happened. And the answers Warner gave, according to the few who wrote anything down, never changed, never grew, never picked up new details the way a tall tale does. He described the same thing in 1933 that he described in 1958, the polish, the seams, the note. A story that grows is a story a man is building. A story that stays exactly the same for 25 years is usually a story a man cannot get rid of. There is one more piece of the setup that matters, and it is the drought. People forget how bad it was, because the great dust storms we all picture came a couple of years later and hit the plains further north and west. But East Texas in 1933 was cracked and thirsty in its own right, and water was not an abstraction, water was survival. A rancher without a working well was a rancher watching his herd die and his land turn to nothing. So the pressure on that crew was not academic curiosity about a strange rock. The pressure was to get water flowing before the cattle went under. Every hour they spent puzzling over the floor was an hour the rancher was not getting his well, and money the rancher did not have was ticking away on a rig he was paying for by the day. Remember that, because it is the quietest and most decisive force in this entire story. Not a shadowy hand. Just a poor man in a dry year who needed the drill to keep going down and could not afford to care what it had gone down through. So the crew kept working. Over 2 long days, Warner and his men widened the hole and shored the casing and did the slow, dangerous business of trying to clear the top of whatever they had struck. They expected to expose the crown of a big rock. Instead, as they washed the clay away with a hand pump and a bucket brigade, they exposed a surface. A flat surface. Not flat the way nature is sometimes almost flat. Flat the way a floor is flat. And when the youngest man, a teenager named only as the Pruitt boy in the one account that survives, reached down with a wire brush and scrubbed the mud out of a groove he had found, the groove turned out to be a seam, a joint. The straight, deliberate line where one cut block of pale stone met another cut block of pale stone fitted so tightly together that after all those years underground you still could not have slid a razor blade between them. The Pruitt boy called it marble, and the name stuck, and that is the word that ended up in the report. Whether it was true marble or some polished limestone or something none of them had a word for, we do not know, because the sample they cut is part of what went missing, but every account agrees on the important thing. It was worked stone. It was pale. It was hard. It was polished to a shine that mud could not dull, and it was laid in a pattern of interlocking blocks by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. 90 feet down, under a pasture, in a county whose written history goes back barely a century. And there is a detail here that the mundane explanations have a very hard time swallowing, because it is not the kind of thing a mud trick invents. As the crew cleared more of the surface over that second day, the Pruitt boy found more than seams. He found a mark, cut into one of the blocks, shallow but unmistakable once the mud was brushed clear, was a shape. The accounts that survive disagree on exactly what it looked like, which is honestly what you would expect from real testimony rather than a rehearsed hoax, and that disagreement is worth pausing on. One version calls it a star with too many points to be a star anyone drew in Texas. Another calls it a set of nested rings, circles inside circles, like the ripples a stone makes in water frozen into stone itself. A third, the one Warner himself reportedly favoured, describes it as a kind of interlocking knot, a single line that wove over and under itself and came back to where it started with no beginning and no end. Whatever it was carved, not scratched, not weathered, not the accidental doodle of erosion, cut with intention into stone that was already, by any reading of the layers above it, older than the county, older than the state, older than the idea of Texas. And a carved symbol is a very specific kind of evidence, because a carved symbol is language. A carved symbol means somebody was not just building, somebody was saying something. Somebody stood on that floor, when it was a floor and not a buried mystery, and decided that this particular block should carry this particular mark, for reasons that made sense to a mind we have no record of and no name for. You do not carve a symbol into your basement slab, you carve a symbol into a thing that matters, a threshold, a tomb, a temple, the center of a room that was the center of something. And that single carved mark, more than the depth, more than the polish, more than the ring, is the thing that turns this from a geological curiosity into something that reaches up out of the ground and grabs you by the collar. Because it means the floor was not just made, it was meant. Now, if you have never fallen down this particular rabbit hole before, your instinct right now is probably a healthy one. You are thinking, there has to be an ordinary explanation, and you are right to think that. So, before we go 1 inch further, let us do the thing the internet almost never does. Let us try, honestly, to explain it away. Explanation 1. It was a natural rock formation that just happened to look worked. This happens. There are basalt columns in Ireland so geometric that for centuries people insisted a giant built them. But basalt columns are six-sided and rough, and they do not ring like a bell, and they do not have polished seams you cannot fit a razor into. Warner had spent 30 years telling the difference between what nature makes and what men make. That was literally his job. So we can note this explanation, and we can set it gently to the side. Explanation 2. It was something modern that got buried. A cistern floor, a foundation, a slab from some forgotten building. This is the strongest ordinary answer, and it deserves respect. Except for the depth. 90 feet is not a buried foundation. 90 feet is not a root cellar. To bury a stone floor 90 feet under a Texas pasture, you would need to explain where 90 vertical feet of undisturbed, naturally layered sand and clay and limestone came from, sitting on top of it, in a region where the recorded history contains no such structure and no such burial. The layers above it were not fill. Warner drilled through them. He knew fill when he saw it, and this was not fill. It was geology, which means the floor was not lowered into the ground. The ground rose up over the floor, and that is a very different and much larger problem. Explanation 3, and this is the one the county eventually landed on, at least on paper. Somebody was mistaken. The men got excited, the light was bad, the mud played tricks, and a hard rock became a marble floor in the retelling. That is a comfortable story. It is also the story that requires you to believe that 3 working drillers in an oil county could not tell a rock from a fitted stone surface that rang when they struck it. And it is the story that does not explain why, if there was nothing there, the case file needed to disappear at all. You do not shred a report about a rock, so we are left with a genuinely uncomfortable middle. Every ordinary explanation either contradicts the testimony of the men who were standing there, or requires burying a structure under 90 feet of solid, layered earth, or asks us to believe that a report about nothing was worth making vanish. None of those are easy. Pick your discomfort. But do not pretend there is a clean, boring answer sitting right there, because there is not, and the people telling you there is have usually not looked at the depth. Which brings us to the surveyor. His name, in the fragments that survive, was T.R. Alderman. And he was the man the county sent out when Warner, to his lasting regret, decided to do everything by the book. Warner did not try to hide what he had found. He was not that kind of man. He reported it because in his mind he had drilled into somebody's property, some old structure, and there were rules about that. He wanted it on the record so that no one could later accuse him of damaging something or hiding it. He wanted, in other words, exactly the protection that the record was supposed to provide. Alderman came out with a notebook, a camera, and an assistant. He spent most of a day at the site, and by every account that comes down to us, he stopped being a bored county official somewhere around the 2nd hour, because Alderman was educated. He had studied geology at a proper university. He understood the layers. He understood the depth. And when he lay down on his belly at the lip of that shored hole and looked at the polished, seamed, pale surface 90 feet below him, catching the light of a lowered lantern, He understood immediately that he was looking at something that was not supposed to be able to exist. The report he wrote is the ghost at the center of this whole story, and we know a little about it only because two people who read it before it vanished later described it. Alderman recorded the depth. He recorded the composition as far as he could tell, and he used the word masonry, not rock, masonry. He noted the fitted joints and the polish. He noted the acoustic quality, the ring. He took photographs, at least 4 of them, and he cut, or had Warner cut, a small sample of the stone for testing. He assigned the site a case number, and, in the detail that keeps a lot of people up at night, he recommended that the state be notified and that further excavation be halted until a qualified party could examine the find. He filed all of it before the middle of November. By the end of that same winter, the case number led to an empty folder. The photographs were gone, the sample was gone, and T.R. Alderman had accepted a position in another part of the state and was, according to the one man who tried to follow up, not eager to discuss East Texas at all. Now, a single missing folder is not a conspiracy. Folders get lost. The 1930s were not a tidy decade. Records burned in courthouse fires all the time, and a cynic could stack this whole thing on the pile of ordinary rural carelessness and walk away clean. If that is where you want to get off, I understand, and honestly I cannot prove you wrong. But before you go, I want to widen the lens, because the reason this particular vanished report has haunted people for 90 years is not the report by itself, it is the pattern the report fits into. And once you see the pattern, the Rusk County floor stops looking like a fluke and starts looking like one data point in something much larger and much stranger. Because here is the thing almost nobody tells you when they tell this story. The Texas floor is not unique. It is not even rare. Go looking through old newspapers, the small county weeklies that nobody was curating for national consumption, and you find them scattered across the American continent like coins under a couch cushion. A well crew in Illinois in the 1890s that reported striking a slab of dressed stone with what looked like carving on it at a depth of over 100 feet. A mining operation in the Sierra Nevada foothills that logged tools and worked objects pulled out of rock that the geology said was millions of years old, the so-called Table Mountain finds, argued over by respectable scientists in respectable journals before the argument quietly died. Coal seams, coal, the compressed remains of ancient forests that were reported to contain chains and coins, and once, in a widely printed account, an iron pot pressed into the coal like a fossil. Reports of walls, floors, and dressed stone turning up during the digging of canals and the sinking of wells, from Ohio to Missouri to the deserts of the Southwest. The list goes on longer than most people ever suspect, because these stories were never gathered into one place on purpose. They lived and died in local papers, each one a small 9 days wonder in a single town, none of them ever meeting the others. A crew digging a waterworks in the Midwest that brought up, from far below the frost line, a section of what looked like a paved road, curbstones and all, running off in 2 directions into ground no one intended to excavate. Quarrymen who split a block of solid stone and found, pressed into the very center of it where no crack reached, a shaped object of metal that had no business surviving in rock that old. Miners who followed a coal seam into the dark and came out swearing they had passed a wall, a smooth vertical face of fitted blocks that the mine simply drove through and left behind because coal was the paycheck and walls were not. Farmers whose ploughs caught, again and again, on the tops of buried stone that ran in straight lines across their fields, lines too regular to be nature, that they cursed and dug around and never once thought to report to anyone who might have cared. And the reactions, across a century and a continent, are always the same, which is the detail that ought to bother you most. Nobody investigates, nobody excavates. The find is noted, marvelled at for an afternoon, and then covered back up because the work has to continue and the mystery does not pay. The road gets paved over, the coal gets shipped, the field gets planted, the well gets capped. Every single time, the ordinary, grinding, economic need of the living to keep living wins out over the buried question, and the buried question stays buried. It is almost as if the world has a mechanism, not a plot, not a conspiracy, just a mechanism for making sure that anything inconvenient enough stays in the ground. And that mechanism has a name we already used tonight. It is called needing the paycheck more than the answer. Any one of these, on its own, you can explain away. A hoax here, a misidentification there, a slow news week, and an editor who needed to fill a column. And plenty of them surely were exactly that. But the sheer volume of them, the way they cluster, the way they keep describing the same impossible thing, work stone and work metal at depths, and in strata where our history says no work stone or metal should be, that volume is harder to wave off. At some point, a big enough pile of anomalies stops being noise. At some point, the pile is the signal. And this is where we have to say the word that this whole story has been circling. Because there is a name for the idea that the American continent, and in fact the whole world, was once covered by a single advanced civilization that our official history has almost entirely erased. The people who chase this idea call that lost civilization Tartaria. Stay with me, even if that word makes you want to close the tab, because I am not asking you to believe anything. I am asking you to look at the shape of the claim and then decide for yourself how well the Rusk County floor fits inside it. The Tartaria idea, stripped down to its bones, goes like this. Sometime in the past few centuries, more recently than you would ever guess, there existed a global civilization far more advanced, far more unified, and far more beautiful than the one our textbooks describe. It built the ornate stone cities whose bones we still live inside, the grand old train stations and courthouses and opera houses and World's Fair palaces that we are told were thrown up in a year or two by men with hand tools and horses. It ran, the idea goes, on a kind of clean, abundant energy drawn from the atmosphere itself, which is why so many of its buildings are crowned with spires and domes and antennae, like ornaments that serve no purpose our own architects can name. And then, within a shockingly short window of time, that civilization was brought down, erased. Its history rewritten, its technology buried, its orphaned children scattered, and its surviving structures reassigned to lesser builders and later dates so that no one would ask the obvious question. Now here is the part that matters for us, and it is the part that ties a mud-caked drilling rig in Texas to this enormous, almost unbelievable claim. Because the Tartaria idea has a specific answer for how you erase a civilization's buildings without an army of demolition crews. You bury them. Or rather, something buries them. The theory calls it the mud flood. The mud flood is the observation, and it genuinely is an observation, that all over the world there are old, grand buildings whose ground floors are underground. Buildings whose beautiful arched windows are now half sunk below the modern street, whose original front doors open onto packed dirt, whose first story has been turned into a basement by some event that raised the level of the earth around them by 10, 20, 30 feet. Walk through the old quarter of almost any city with a European-style downtown, and you can find them, doorways and window arches disappearing below the sidewalk. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And the official explanation is always the same. The city built up over time, debris accumulated. The street level rose, which is true and happens and is boring. But the mud flood idea asks a sharper question. What if it did not happen slowly? What if, in places, the earth rose over these buildings, not across 1,000 years of trash, but in a single catastrophic layer of mud and sediment, a continent-scaled event that drowned the ground floors of a whole civilization and left the survivors to dig out and pretend, or to genuinely forget, that anything had happened at all. And if that is true, if there was an event that laid down a thick blanket of new earth across the land, then you do not have to bury a marble floor by hand 90 feet deep in Texas. You do not need a conspiracy of shovels. You need one event. One flood of mud and stone and water that covered the old floor and everything on it, and then set, and then had grass grow over it, and cattle graze on it, and a rancher build a fence across it, none of them ever suspecting that 90 feet below their boots was the polished floor of a room that belonged to a world that was told to us as a fairy tale. There is a piece of this that hits harder than the mud in the ground, and it is the buildings we can still see with our own eyes. Look at the grand old architecture that fills the historic core of nearly every major city on Earth. The immense stone train stations with their vaulted ceilings and their carved facades, the state capitals and county courthouses, absurdly ornate for the muddy frontier towns they supposedly rose in, the exhibition halls, the opera houses, the cathedrals whose stonework would bankrupt a modern nation to reproduce. We are told these were built quickly, cheaply, by small crews of men with hand chisels and horse-drawn carts, in towns that a few years earlier had barely existed and could barely feed themselves. And we accept it because we have always been told it, and because the alternative is too strange to hold in the mind for long. But then there are the World's Fairs, and the World's Fairs are where the whole comfortable story develops a crack you cannot unsee. Because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, cities across America and Europe hosted these enormous expositions, and the photographs are real, and the records are in every library. Vast, gleaming white cities of palaces and domes and grand boulevards and lagoons, some of them larger than the actual cities that hosted them, covered in statuary and detail that would take a lifetime to carve. The official history says they were built in a year or two out of a temporary plaster and burlap material used for a single summer, and then, almost every one of them, deliberately demolished, torn down, erased. Some by fire, some by wrecking crew, the most beautiful architecture a generation would ever see, put up in a season and pulled down in another. And the Tartaria idea looks at those photographs and asks the question that will not leave you alone once it has arrived: what if it was backwards? What if those glorious buildings were not thrown up in a year for a summer festival, but were already there, older than the fair, part of the old world, and the fair was the cover story? What if the demolition afterward was not the tidy clean-up of a temporary event, but the erasing of evidence, the tearing down of the last standing pieces of a civilization so that the new one could pour concrete over the memory the way Warner poured concrete over the floor? You do not have to believe it. But once you have really looked at the photographs, and really sat with the claim that men in the age of the horse and the hand chisel built a marble city larger than Paris in 18 months only to smash it to rubble that same year, you will find that the official story asks you to swallow something almost as large as the one it is trying to replace. That is the claim. That is the shape the Rusk County floor is accused of fitting. Now let us test it, because a claim this big should have to earn every inch. The first and best objection is the one you are already thinking. If there was a global civilization within the last few centuries, where are its records? Where are the newspapers, the diaries, the government files, the millions of ordinary people who would have remembered it? A secret you can bury in the ground. A secret in the memory of an entire population is a different kind of thing. And the Tartaria answer to that is uncomfortable, and I am going to give it to you straight rather than pretend it away, because dodging the hard part is how you end up believing things you should not. The answer involves the children. Between roughly the 1850s and the 1930s, something happened in the United States and in several other countries that we do talk about, that is in the record, and that we have simply decided is normal. Enormous numbers of children, orphaned or declared orphaned, were gathered up and moved. In America, they called them the orphan trains, and the standard history says that over that period, around 250,000 children were loaded onto trains in the eastern cities and shipped west to be taken in, or taken on, by families who needed labour. 250,000 children. The official reason is poverty and immigration and urban overcrowding, and that reason is real, and for most of those kids, it is the whole story. But the Tartaria idea looks at that same era, the sudden institutionalizing of the young on a massive scale, the enormous new asylums and poorhouses and orphanages built to hold them, buildings that are themselves often the grand old architecture in question, and it asks a darker question. What is the fastest way to erase the memory of a civilization? You do not have to kill the adults. You just have to make sure the children do not learn what the adults knew. You raise a generation inside a new story. You give them new history books, printed fresh, and one lifetime later there is no one left who remembers the old world firsthand, only a few strange buildings that are too beautiful for the dates on their plaques, and a few old-timers muttering about things nobody believes. I want to be careful and fair here. I am not telling you that this is what happened to the orphan trains. The documented painful, human history of those children is real, and it deserves to be treated as more than a prop in a theory. Most of those kids were exactly who the record says they were. But you asked, or your objection asked, how you could possibly erase a living memory, and the honest answer is that the machinery for doing it, the mass movement of children, and the mass printing of a new official history was not only possible in that era, it was, on the ordinary record, actually running. Before we get to the money, we have to talk about the power, not political power, electrical power. Because the strangest thread running through this whole idea, and the one that turns it from a curiosity about old buildings into something with real economic teeth, is the claim about energy. Look again at that old architecture, the theory says, and notice the crowns, the spires, the domes, the finials and the ornamental metal towers and the strange antenna-like structures perched on top of buildings whose function has nothing to do with radio in an age before radio. Notice how many of the grand old structures are studded with copper, wrapped in iron, topped with points that reach up into the sky for no reason our own engineers can explain. The Tartaria idea says those were not decoration. It says they were apparatus, that the old world ran on a method of drawing energy out of the atmosphere itself, out of the charge that sits between the ground and the sky. A method demonstrated and then quietly shelved in our own recorded history by more than one inventor whose name you half remember from a school textbook, filed under eccentric, filed under failed, filed under do not look too closely. And it points out, correctly, that this is not a fantasy invented on the internet. There genuinely was a moment, right around the turn of the last century, when serious men with serious laboratories were chasing the idea of wireless, distributed, meterless power, and there genuinely was a moment when that chase stopped, when the funding dried up, and the towers came down and the world settled, permanently, on a model where energy runs through wires you do not own, from plants you cannot see, billed to you by the unit, forever. Now sit with the economics of those two worlds side by side, because this is the whole game. In the first world, power is in the air, free for anyone with the apparatus to draw it, the way the old buildings supposedly drew it. In the second world, our world, power is a product. It is generated in one place, sold, metered, and delivered through infrastructure that a handful of interests own and everyone else rents. One of those worlds cannot be taxed, cannot be monopolized, cannot be leveraged into an empire of utilities and debt. The other one is the foundation of the entire modern economy. And if you were standing at the hinge point between them, if you were one of the people who would own the wires and the plants and the meters in the second world, then the first world was not a wonder to be preserved. It was a threat to be buried. Deeper, if necessary, than 90 feet. Now let us bring it back to the economics, because that is the lens I promised you, and because it is, in the end, the lens that makes the coldest sense of all of this. Ask yourself who benefits. Not from the mystery, from the burial. If there was once a civilization running on cheap or free energy drawn from the air, on architecture built to last 1,000 years, on some economic arrangement we do not even have the words for anymore, then that civilization was, from the point of view of anyone who wanted to sell you energy and rent you shelter and lend you money, a catastrophe. You cannot build an empire of debt on top of people who do not need you. You cannot charge a man for power if the power is simply in the sky. You cannot sell a 30-year mortgage to a society that builds in stone that outlives its grandchildren. But you can, if the old world is buried and forgotten, build all of that on the ruins, and here is where the year comes screaming back in. Because 1933, the exact year that marble floor came out of the Texas ground, is one of the most important years in the entire history of money, and almost nobody thinks about why. In 1933, in the depths of the Great Depression, the government of the United States did something extraordinary. By executive order, it required American citizens to hand in their gold coins, their gold certificates, their bullion, turned over to the government in exchange for paper dollars, under threat of fine and imprisonment. It was one of the largest transfers of real, hard wealth from ordinary people to the state in the nation's history, and it happened in the same window, in the same country, in the same year, that a crew in Texas was pulling work stone out of the ground, and a surveyor was writing a report that would not survive the winter. I am not going to stand here and tell you those two things are the same conspiracy. That would be dishonest, and I do not know it, and neither does anyone selling you a video that says otherwise with total confidence. But I will point at the shape of the year, because the shape is worth seeing. 1933 was a year of burial. It buried gold in federal vaults. It buried the old rules of money and replaced them with new ones. It buried a generation's faith in the idea that what they had earned was truly theirs. It was, whatever else it was, a great resetting, a moment when the powerful reached into the pockets of the ordinary and rewrote the terms of the entire economy while everyone was too hungry and too frightened to stop them. Think about what a reset actually requires, in cold, practical terms. To change the rules of an entire economy, you need one thing above all else. You need the people living under the old rules to stop believing the old rules were ever real, or ever fair, or ever coming back. You need them to accept that the way things are now is simply the way things are, and always more or less were. A population that clearly remembers a better arrangement is a population that will fight to get it back. A population that has forgotten, or was never told, will accept almost anything, because it has nothing to measure the present against. That is the deep logic that connects a buried flaw to a confiscated coin, and it is why I keep circling back to it even though I cannot prove the wire that runs between them. Both are acts of forgetting made physical. The gold going into the vault is the old money being taken out of living memory, replaced by paper that only has value because you are told it does. The floor going back under the concrete is the old world being taken out of living memory, replaced by a history that only holds together because no one is allowed to dig. In both cases, the mechanism is the same. Something real and solid and inconvenient is removed from where people can touch it, and a story is left in its place. And in both cases, the people doing the removing do not need to be cartoon villains in a dark room. They only need to be ordinary, powerful people, acting in what they believe is the necessary interest of order, in a frightened year, when no one has the strength to ask too many questions. A civilization does not get erased in a day by a single hand. It gets erased the way a debt gets erased in a bankruptcy, one write down at a time, each one reasonable, each one urgent, each one leaving the ledger a little further from the truth, until one morning you look at the books and the old numbers are simply gone, and the new numbers are all anyone has ever known. 1933 was a year of write-downs, of the ledger being rewritten while the country was too weak to check the math. And a marble floor under a Texas pasture was, in the grand accounting of that year, a rounding error, a single strange entry that did not fit the new books. And the easiest thing to do with an entry that does not fit is to erase it and move on and let the winter cover the rest. And in a year like that, in a decade like that, is it really so strange to imagine that a report about an impossible flaw, a flaw that hinted at a whole buried world and a whole buried economy that made no sense under the new rules, might quietly find its way into a stove? There is one more chapter, and it belongs to the people who came later, the ones who heard the story second-hand and could not let it go. Because a story like this does not simply die when the men who lived it die. It gets handed down, quietly, at kitchen tables and on porches, and every so often it lands on someone who has the itch to go looking. And over the decades, a few people did. A grandchild of the Pruitt boy, according to one account, spent years trying to pin down the exact stretch of pasture, working from a family memory of a fence line and a bend in a creek and the direction of the afternoon sun. Others chased the paper, writing to the county for the case file that Alderman had opened and getting back the same answer every time in the polite and final language of clerks. No such record could be located. The number, if it ever existed, corresponded to nothing on the shelves. And here is where the story does one last thing that a pure invention would never do. It refuses to give you the ending you want, because the land changed. Boom counties change fast, and East Texas changed faster than most. The pasture was sold, and sold again. Fence lines moved. A creek was diverted or dammed or simply dried. Wells were drilled all over that country by the thousands in the decades that followed, and any one of them might have passed within a few feet of the capped hole without anyone knowing, because the map that would have told them where to look had emptied itself into an empty folder in the winter of 1933. The people who went searching did not find a flaw. They did not find a hole. They found a stretch of ordinary Texas ground, grazed and fenced and utterly silent, that matched the story in every general way and confirmed it in no specific one, which is, of course, exactly what you would find, whether the flaw was there or whether it never was. That is the maddening symmetry at the heart of this. A capped, 90 feet down, its record destroyed, on land that has changed hands and changed shape for 90 years, is invisible. It looks precisely like nothing. The absence of evidence and the perfect concealment of evidence are, from the surface, the same field of grass. And so the searchers came home the way the surveyor went away, and the way the driller drove off, with a story they could not prove and could not shake, and added their names to the quiet list of people who have stood on that ground and wondered what is under their boots. Let me tell you what happened to the men. Elias Warner finished the job. This is the detail that I find the hardest to shake, and it is the detail that the tidy explanations never quite account for. Warner did not get to excavate the floor. He did not get to bring an archaeologist. After Alderman filed his report, and the site sat under a tarp for a couple of weeks, word came down, and the word was not investigate. The word was cap it. Warner was instructed to fill the hole, to pour the well, to seal the casing, and to move his rig off the land. The official reason, as it filtered down to him, was liability and water rights, and the simple economic pressure of a depression in which no county and no landowner had the money to fund a dig into the unknown when what everyone needed was a working well and a paycheck. And that reason, I have to admit, is almost good enough. It is exactly the kind of dull, plausible, money-driven decision that gets made 1,000 times a year and buries 1,000 strange things without anyone ever intending a cover-up at all. Sometimes the mud flood is just poverty. Sometimes the thing that erases the old world is nothing more sinister than the fact that keeping it would have cost more than anyone had. So Warner capped the well. He poured concrete down onto a polished stone floor that had waited 90 feet underground for who knows how many hundreds or thousands of years, and he sealed it back into the dark, and he drove his rig home. He told the story for the rest of his life to anyone who would listen, and most people did not, and the ones who did mostly smiled the way you smile at an old man's fishtail. The Pruitt boy grew up and went to the war, and came back and told his own children about the day the ground rang like a bell, and T.R. Alderman, the surveyor, the educated man who wrote masonry in his notebook and recommended the state be called, spent the rest of his career somewhere else and, by every account, did not care to talk about the folder that emptied itself. That is the story, as far as anyone can reconstruct it. And I want to be honest with you about what we have and what we do not, because the honesty is the whole point, and because the people who are not honest with you about this are usually the ones trying to sell you something. What we do not have is proof. We do not have the report. We do not have the photographs. We do not have the sample. And so we cannot put the stone under a microscope and settle in an afternoon what the ground would otherwise argue about for a century. We have testimony, second-hand and third-hand, worn smooth by 90 years of retelling. We have a case number that leads to an empty folder, which is suggestive and is also exactly what ordinary carelessness looks like. We have a pattern of similar reports across the continent, which is genuinely striking and also genuinely the kind of thing that human beings are extremely good at seeing whether or not it is truly there. If you came to me demanding that I prove a marble floor sits 90 feet under a Texas pasture, I could not do it. Nobody could. That is the honest flaw of this whole thing. But here is what I would ask you to sit with, because it is the part that does not go away no matter how skeptical you are, and I count myself among the skeptical. Strip out Tartaria. Strip out the mud flood. Strip out the orphan trains and the gold and every enormous claim we have piled up tonight. Set all of it aside, and you are still left with a small, hard, stubborn core that the tidy explanations do not touch. 3 working men in an oil county, who knew the ground for a living, put a drill into a pasture and hit something at 90 feet that behaved like nothing natural any of them had ever drilled. A trained surveyor came out, looked at it, and wrote a word that means made by human hands. He recommended the state be told, and then the record of it went away, and the men were told to pour concrete over it and go home. You do not have to believe in a lost global civilization to find that unsettling. You only have to believe that those 4 men existed and were not idiots. And the record, the ordinary boring record, says that they did and that they were not. So what do we do with that? Maybe nothing. Maybe it is exactly what the county decided it was: a hard rock and an excitable crew and a folder that a clerk misfiled in a hungry year, and the whole thing is a beautiful campfire story with a mundane heart. That is genuinely possible, and if you walk away tonight believing that, you are in good and reasonable company. Or maybe, just maybe, 90 feet under a stretch of East Texas cattle country, there is still a floor, pale, polished, fitted so tightly you could not slide a razor between the blocks, laid by hands that belonged to a world we were told never existed. Sealed under Depression-era concrete by a tired man following orders, waiting in the dark the way it has waited all along, for someone with a drill and a reason and the nerve to ask the ground one more time what it is really standing on. The thing about a buried floor is that it does not care whether you believe in it. It does not need your faith, and it does not need your case number. It is either there or it is not, and the earth is under no obligation to tell you which. All the earth does is keep it patiently, the way it has kept every other thing we decided we were better off not knowing. And the strangest part, the part I keep coming back to, is how easy it is to bury something. Not with a grand conspiracy, not with armies and shovels and men in dark rooms. You bury it the way 1,933 buried almost everything, with a hungry year and a plausible reason and a folder that no one has the time or the money or the courage to keep. You bury it by moving on, by needing the paycheck more than the answer, by deciding, quietly, each in our own way, that the water matters more than whatever the water is sitting on top of. That is how a floor disappears. That is how a report vanishes by winter. And that, in the end, may be the only real lesson under all of this. Not that there was a hidden empire, though there may have been. Not that the money was reset while we starved, though it was. But that the surest way to erase a thing is not to destroy it, it is to convince everyone that it was never worth digging up in the first place. I think about that hollow note more than anything else in this whole story. The ring, because sound like that does not come from a solid thing. A struck boulder gives you a dead thud. A bell gives you a tone, because a bell is hollow, because there is a shaped, empty space inside it for the sound to live in and come back out of. And Warner's weighted line, dropped 90 feet down onto that pale, polished surface, did not thud. It rang. Which means, if the men were telling the truth, and I have found no good reason to think they were not, that the floor was not the top of a solid mass of buried stone. It was the top of something with room underneath it, a space, a hollow, a chamber that Warner never opened and never saw, sealed now under his own concrete, holding whatever air has been trapped down there since before anyone thought to call that country Texas. He capped a lid, and he never once got to lift it. The rancher got his well. The county got its paperwork and then lost it. The men got old and died, and the story got passed down and laughed at and slowly forgotten, the way these things always are. And somewhere out past the last fence line, under the grass and the cattle and 90 feet of layered Texas earth, something pale and polished and perfectly made is still waiting for the tap of a weighted line, and the clean, hollow, impossible sound of the ground ringing like a bell. Some things are lost, some things are only waiting, and the ground, patient as it has always been, keeps its own quiet counsel, and gives up its answer to no one who is not yet willing to go back down into the dark and ask it one final time.